Extension lights are located on the bombardier's control panel, on the sidewall left of the pilot, and at the left of the radio operator. Reflector lights are found over the radio table, the liaison transmitter, and the navigator's table. Finally, there are the light over the bomb sight and the lamp in the drift meter. These interior lights also can be tested by an assistant. While in the bombardier's compartment, the assistant can also test the two remaining oxygen outlets, and a two-way check can be made of the bomber pilot call. Completing his inspection of the bombardier's compartment, the assistant sees that the automatic flight control equipment is covered and moves on to the cockpit to assist the crew chief during the engine check. During this phase of the pre-flight, the entire interior of the airplane has been inspected for cleanliness and security of attachment. All oxygen outlets have been tested. Levels have been checked in both the anti-icer and hydraulic fluid reservoirs. The propellers have been pulled through and inspected. Instruments have been checked for cleanliness and static readings. Surface controls, trim tabs, and flaps have been checked. And all lights have been tested. These items comprise the interior inspection, the second of the three main divisions of the pre-flight inspection. The third and final part of the pre-flight inspection is the engine check, which may be considered in two parts: warm-up and operational check. This test will be performed by the crew chief and one assistant inside the cockpit, while the other assistant is kept posted outside. Engines are started as prescribed in the technical orders covering the B.17 airplane and its engines. All mechanics operating the engines are expected to be familiar with and to follow closely these instructions. Before starting engine number 2, check the hydraulic pressure gauge for a reading between 600 and 750 and set the vacuum selector handle to left. After engine number 2 has been started, the flight indicator may be checked. With a vacuum reading of 4 inches of mercury, the indicator should settle in 2 minutes. Meanwhile, of course, the other engines are started. After each engine is running, turn its booster switch to off. To avoid vibration, do not idle below 900 RPM. Keep constant check on the instruments to see that all engines are running smoothly. Fuel pressure should be between 12 and 16 pounds. Oil pressure between 70 and 80. Oil temperature should remain between 70 and 88. And cylinder head temperature must not exceed 205 centigrade. When the engines are warm, the operational checks may begin. With the propeller control set at high RPM and the superchargers in the off position, accelerate the engines and check the manifold pressure gauge to see that the needle moves freely. Make a full-range operational check of the propeller controls by moving them from high RPM position to low RPM, observing the tachometer. Run the engines up to cruising speed. With the generator line switches on, the ammeter should indicate charge. Also, check the voltage of each generator. Then signal to the armorer and radio mechanic that it is all right to start the bomb bay and turret inspections and operate the transmitters. The fuel transfer pump is located at the rear of the cockpit. To test it, set both selector valves in any wing tank position. If no bomb bay tanks are installed, be sure the valves are not set to the bomb bay position. Set the switch to either of the on positions and place your hand on the pump, which is located beneath the catwalk, to make sure it's operating. With the switch in the other extreme position, test the reverse direction of the motor in the same way. When the test is completed, return the control switch to the mid position and the selector valves to off. Test the operation of the engines on each magneto, noting loss of RPM. Then, at about 1/3 throttle, turn the ignition switch off to see that it's working. It must be turned back on immediately. The vacuum pumps are tested by setting the selector on left and right and checking the vacuum pressure gauge. The heater control is operated to the limits to check range of movement. Test the de-icer mechanism and have the observer outside check the functioning of all cells along the wings, horizontal stabilizer, and vertical fin. Finally, with the propellers at high RPM, open the throttle full and test the superchargers by moving the regulators far enough to show an increase in manifold pressure. This increase indicates that the supercharger is functioning. When this test has been made individually, with each of the 4 regulators, the engine check is complete. In review, this engine check has consisted of 2 parts. During warm-up, the engine instruments are checked to see that the engines are functioning properly. Operational checks are made of propellers, throttles, magnetos, superchargers, and the fuel transfer pump. Thus is completed the entire pre-flight inspection, consisting of the exterior inspection, the interior inspection, and the engine check. After making sure that the armorer has completed his bomb bay and turret inspections, and the radio mechanic has checked the transmitter, the engines may be stopped in accordance with the procedure set forth in the technical orders. After checking with his assistants and verifying that the auxiliary equipment is in order, the crew chief signs the flight report. Usually, little trouble shows up during the pre-flight inspection. However, an occasional defect is bound to develop. A broken static ground, a loose fire extinguisher, faulty oxygen regulator, a loose cannon plug, a leaky brake hose. It might be anything, and it might be fatal. Such faults must be caught on the pre-flight inspection, and they must be corrected or marked on the flight report. Thus, when the crew chief has done his job right, the true condition of the airplane will be apparent to the pilot before takeoff.
You're right on time.
You wanted to know about B.17 pilot training. Well, largely it's a matter of putting across what we know about the airplane, what it'll do and what it shouldn't be asked to do. Maybe airplanes are like people. You don't really get to know them until after you've lived with them a while. Takes time, too, to get well acquainted with an airplane. Time to find out just how far you can go with her and still stay friends. That's important. And men like our instructor have lived with this airplane long enough to become pretty good friends with her. So his job is just a matter of giving you the benefit of his experience. The procedure is pretty well standardized, and you'll learn to be thankful for that. Routine, like this circle tour of the airplane at the start, for instance, makes the student's life a lot simpler. In the cockpit, you'll learn to follow the checklist because it helps you to keep your mind on your work. Detail's important when you're flying a big bomber, and using the checklist means you don't overlook a thing. After you get the plane off the ramp and down near the runway, you're ready for the run-up, one of the most important checks of all.
Center at an angle. That gets all your props safe over concrete for the run-up, and if there's a guy behind you, you won't blast him when you rev him up.
As your co-pilot, the instructor locks the tail wheel while she's rolling, so that when the wheel's in line, the lock pin will drop into place. Tail wheel locked. And brakes.
Brakes set.
Maybe here you'll switch to interphone. Easier to talk that way. Then the checklist again, and the instructor's command to check trim tabs. Set them at 0. Elevator trim tab, rudder, aileron. Then,
Before the run-up, always check your oil temperature. You ought to have at least 40 degrees before beginning the run-up.
Why not close cowl flaps? Hurry it up a little.
It might mean trouble. If you close them, you get uneven cooling, local hot spots, metal fatigue.
I get it. Just like bending a wire back and forth until it breaks.
That's it.
Exercise turbos?
Right.
you advance throttles to 1,500 RPM for turbo exercise. And you know why it's important. To get warm oil circulating through the turbo regulators. If regulator oil is stiff or congealed, the turbo wastegates won't react properly. One avoidable cause of a runaway turbo on takeoff. Leaving turbos on, you do a repeat on the props. Give them plenty of time to change pitch. Watch the tacks for that. If it's below freezing, exercise both turbos and props 4 times. Set the lock to keep the levers from creeping. And then, turbo's off. And before the mag check, another important detail.
Before you rev them up, turn on your generators and check each one for ampere output. If they balance, they're all putting out all right.
Ampere output okay.
Now voltage and then turn them off.
$28.5 on each. Generators checked and off.
Check mags at 28 inches, starting with number 1.
While you're boosting manifold pressure, you remember there's a backfire hazard during the mag check. So you check turbos off, wastegates open, just to be sure.
Off. Left.
Don't watch the tank, watch the engine. Roughness doesn't always give you a quick drop in RPM.
Both. Right. Both.
Throttle up to the stop. A quick check of manifold pressure, and then full turbo. Since you're using 91 grade fuel here, you can't draw 46 inches. Power's cut about 10%. You set your lock, check RPM, little below 2,500 on this fuel. Take a look at the engine, and everything okay. Back slowly on the throttle because of the induction backfire hazard. Same procedure on all engines. Back to command to call the tower for takeoff clearance, and you're off to the races.
Lock tail wheel.
Parking brakes. Hold it with your feet on the runway. Less hazard if you have to get away fast. Gyro. Set the gyro compass and check your compass heading against the heading of the runway.
Gyro set.
Generators.
Generators on.
Tailwheel locked. Light out. Now let's see your rider. 3-point takeoff.
3-point.
3-point. Hold the tail down, but don't give it enough pressure to cause a lot of wheel drag. And remember, you fly the airplane. I'll watch the engine.
The cow flaps open.
Right. Hold the brakes until you get 25 inches, then let her go. You'll have rudder control by the time you're hitting 50 miles an hour. With a crosswind, you might have to use the throttles a little. Rudder's enough today.
On 100 octane, you'd be using 46 inches and 2,500 RPM. Little less than that with this fuel. You'll leave the ground at around 100 miles an hour. Then a kick on the brakes to stop the wheel spin and gear up. Get rid of that drag fast. In takeoff emergencies, the bare belly is better than wheels. Check the light, visual inspection later. 130 safe airspeed for power reduction. Manifold pressure first, pilot's job, but today your instructor does it. Then RPM. You'll find it all in the tech orders and your checklist. Co-pilot trails cowl flaps, returning each valve to the locked position.
Check your landing gear.
Up left.
Up right.
And when your flight engineer gets an okay on the tail wheel, the switch is returned to neutral. Things happen fast on the takeoff, and it's easy enough to tense up a little. You did well enough, but...
Don't fight her, she won't throw you. On our next takeoff, you'll reduce power. I'll just make the final adjustments. Hold your airspeed to 135 on the climb. What's our power setting?
35 inches, 2,300.
Let's switch back to interphone again.
Do you always use this power setting for climbing?
Yes, with 91 grade fuel and up to 30,000 feet. If you're climbing on instruments, you should hold your airspeed at 160. Are you keeping her trimmed? Turbo and throttle settings always depend on altitude. For instance, if we'd taken off from a sea level field, we wouldn't need turbo or even full throttle for the early part of the climb. Another thing, always cut down manifold pressure before RPM. What's your altitude?
We're nearly 1,000 feet above the field. Fuel boost pumps off?
At 1,000 minimum. Check fuel pressure before and after. Gives you another check on engine fuel pump operation. Look at your manifold pressure. Manifold pressure will creep up steadily on the climb if you don't watch it. As free air pressure decreases on the climb, the pressure differential across the turbo buckets increases. Gives you higher turbo speed and more pressure from the blower.
What about carburetor air filters?
Turn them off at 8,000. Don't often hit dust above that. In emergencies, though, you can use them up to 15,000.
Dust that high?
No, not dust. Carburetor icing conditions.
So now they're ice filters.
In a way, yes.
Filters off.
Filters take air from inside the wing. In the kind of weather that ices up carburetors, air inside the wing is drier and warmer than that you'd get from the ram air intake. Filter light's green, filters off. Check your manifold pressure. Turning the filters off increases the manifold pressure about 1.5 inches. With carburetor icing conditions, of course, you'd use intercoolers hot, but you won't normally get carburetor icing above 12,000. And up there, you'll always want intercoolers cold. Thin air means higher rate of compression from the supercharger, and compression makes heat.
In the wrong places.
Nearly always in the wrong places.
You level off at 10,000 feet and cut her down to the proper setting for maximum long-range performance on 91 grade fuel. Manifold pressure down first to 28 inches. RPM next. You make this adjustment with one eye on the airspeed indicator because you use whatever RPM needed to get 150 miles per hour indicated. In this case, with your conditions, 1,600 RPM. Then fuel mixtures to auto lean. And your co-pilot closes cowl flaps since you have a safe margin in head temperatures.
What about the other power settings?
Well, you've used 3, modified for 91 grade fuel. Takeoff power, 5 minutes maximum continuous operation, climbing power, and maximum long range. They're all there in the panel. The power setting used in normal cruising is always figured from your flight conditions. Desired range, fuel available, weather conditions, altitude, gross weight, and perhaps 1 or 2 other things. In special cases, you'll always figure your best power setting from your flight computer. All settings are arrived at scientifically. Don't improvise. Play them the way they're written. And always keep an eye on your mixtures. In auto lean, don't use more than 29 inches with 91 grade and 2,000 RPM.
Explain something?
Try to.
That 3-point takeoff.
What about it? Didn't it feel right?
Well, maybe I didn't pull it right. I thought it was a little mushy. Isn't it better with the tail up?
Well,
And what about the stall hazard?
maybe we'd better figure it out on paper.
Well, here we are. An old friend you'll remember from flying school days. She knows her way around. Call her Tail Up Myrtle. Now, take it easy, Myrtle. When Myrtle's parked on the ground, she's sure enough in a stalling or near stalling attitude. So on the takeoff, you lift the tail both to decrease drag and get a safe margin below the stall angle. And she takes off like a nice baby, and there's no arguing about it. But with the missus here, it's different. In the three-point position, she's already in a flying attitude. On the takeoff run, the relative wind's parallel to the ground. So say the ground makes one leg of your angle of attack. Chord line makes the other leg. Angle of attack in three-point attitude, about 10 degrees. But with power on, the stalling angle for this airplane's about 19 degrees. So when you hold the tail down on the takeoff, you have a nice cozy margin of 9 degrees below the stall angle. And when you leave the ground, the path of the relative wind changes, so that the angle of attack actually decreases. You get maybe another 4 degrees of safety, and you haven't a care in the world. Now let's dig a little deeper. Think of the forces at work when you take off as a team of little guys who are in there working for or against you all the time. For instance, gross weight of the airplane. On the ground, he bears down hard on the landing gear. When we're ready to start the takeoff run, you'll meet a pal of his, wheel drag. The harder gross weight bears down on the wheels, the bigger and stronger wheel drag gets. That's definitely not good, especially if your runway's soft or slushy. Think of lift as a kind of muscle man working from the wing, pulling up gross weight. Speed makes him pull harder. An increase in the angle of attack also makes him pull harder. Get the relationship between lift, weight on wheels, and wheel drag. The more lift, the less weight on wheels. Less weight on wheels, smaller wheel drag. Then, of course, there's thrust. He's your power. And aerodynamic drag. He's with you all the time, except when you're parked on the ground. Now, let's try to visualize what happens on a two-point takeoff. At the start of the run, lift increases steadily. Lift takes more and more weight off the wheels. Taking weight off the wheels steadily reduces wheel drag. Then, just when things are looking good, you lift the tail. Angle of attack decreases. That cuts down lift. Lift lets weight go back down on the wheels, and wheel drag increases again. Aerodynamic drag is cut a little, but not enough to compensate for the extra wheel drag. Speed still won't build up as fast as it would with the tail down. Even on a smooth runway, you'll need more room and maybe 20 or 30 miles an hour more speed to get off than if you'd kept your tail down. If the runway's messed up with mud or slush or water, maybe you won't get off at all in the space you have. But keep the tail down. Take advantage of the three-point angle of attack, and lift goes to work on gross weight right away. Wheel drag gets smaller and smaller. You'll be airborne at maybe 100 miles an hour, and without using up all your runway. And that's something to remember when you're lined up on a nice homemade strip in the jungle, with mud underneath you and trees dead ahead.
Well, how do you like her? It's a very little problem when you get over the field. Say you're coming in after a long mission, you're a little short on gas, and when you arrive, the field's closed in.
Beeline for an alternate base.
No, Sal, you're the hell have gone from nowhere. You're lucky to have one base to come home to.